Okay, so one thing I do have an announcement. One of the things I want to mention is that many of you, first of all, I want to thank you for your comments that you did for the Federal Register notice that we did a couple of months ago, where Nicholas talked about all the thousands of comments that we received, and so we're very excited about that. And so one thing I failed to mention is that, now the National Content Test package, if you will, approval, is with OMB right now, and they're reviewing it. And of course, they're very excited like us about this test. And so one thing I do want to mention is that we are in another public comment period, another 30-day public comment period. And so we're going to be sending out to you and other stakeholders the link to where you can provide additional comments, all the comments great comments that we've been hearing here. And so we want to consider your comments and your feedback. Okay, so I just want to mention that, and so we'll be sending that out soon. And so you'll have another opportunity to bring, to give us more feedback on the content test, and of course, everything that we've talked about today. Okay? All right. So now we're ready to begin for session D. I would like to introduce Meraris Rios Vargas, who will lead us into the discussion for session D regarding potential data products featuring Middle Eastern and North African data. Meraris was recently appointed as the chief of the Ethnicity and Ancestry Branch and Population Division. She leads important research focusing on the important patterns and demographic characteristics of the Latino population in the United States and in Puerto Rico and the U.S. islands. She's also an expert on race and ethnicity, and she has conducted extensive outreach, presentations, and workshops with various stakeholder groups. Please help me joining and welcoming Meraris.
I get an applause and nobody else did, huh? So thank you. So thank you, Roberto. And good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're enjoying your snacks. And I'm excited that you're here. And I greatly appreciate all of the insights that you have been sharing with us. We really appreciate your feedback, and we look forward for more. During this session, I will discuss potential data tabulations with you featuring the detailed Middle Eastern and North African population data for the 2020 census. But before that, let's start by reviewing the U.S. Office of Management and Budget Race and Ethnicity Standards. There's a copy of the standards in your binder, and it is critical that you understand these standards, as I mentioned last week in our conference call. And the OMB standards govern the categories used to collect and to present federal data on race and ethnicity. The OMB requires 5 minimum categories on race, which are white, Black or African American, American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian, Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and 2 categories on ethnicity, which are Hispanic or Latino or not Hispanic or Latino. The Census Bureau, along with other federal agencies, follow these standards. To start, I would like to draw your attention to the federal government's definition of white, which Nicholas mentioned earlier today. And this is the definition that pertains to the current racial classification of Middle Eastern or North Africans groups. White is defined as a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. And note the importance of the original peoples concept in the white race definition, which is the philosophy behind our current classification, coding, and tabulation procedures of responses to the race question. This is why detailed responses such as German, Lebanese, or Egyptians are coded as part of the white category. And I'll explain this further on the next slide. On this slide, we provided a conceptual illustration of how the Census Bureau codes write-ins responses to the race question into the white racial category. So for example, a response of Irish is classified as white, French is also classified as white, and similarly, Lebanese is classified as white. This is because they all represent European or Middle Eastern national origins. These data are all aggregated together under white. However, we plan to maintain the detailed responses, such as Irish, French, and Lebanese, so we can tabulate the detailed data. The OMB race standards are the basis or classification of ethnicity responses to the question on race. When OMB standards are not clear about how an ethnicity or nationality response should be assigned a race, then those responses are usually coded or tabulated under some other race category. This is why in the 2010 census, all Middle Eastern and North African responses were coded as white. In order to classify Middle Eastern and North African responses as something other than white, modifications to the current OMB standards would be needed. We are working with OMB and their interagency committee as we conducted this research and collectively contemplating potential considerations for new implementation guidelines that may be needed for the 2020 census and other federal data to address these classification issues. Please be aware, however, that all questions designs that we're exploring in our research permit the reporting of race and/or ethnicity and the reporting of multiple responses. For example, this slide shows how a person may identify with multiple categories in our combined question approach on both the design without a Middle Eastern or North African category on the left and the design which includes a Middle Eastern and North African category, which is on the right side of the slide. The image on the left illustrates where the respondent reported they are white by checking the box and wrote in Lebanese in the area underneath. And they also checked the Black or African American box and wrote in Somali underneath. The image on the right provides another example where the respondent reported they are Black or African American by checking the box, and they wrote in Somali underneath. And they also checked the box for Middle Eastern or North African and wrote in underneath that they're Lebanese. As Nicholas discussed earlier, one of the main objectives of the 2015 National Content Test is to examine how people of the Middle Eastern or North African descent respond to these experimental questions designs and compare those results with follow-up re-interviews in order for us to analyze and understand the complexities of what people are reporting given the different options. This research will enable us to assess and determine which question design produces the best quality data that most accurately represents how people self-identify. This will be measured by overall response rates, detailed reporting of race and ethnic groups, and the reliability and validity measures of the re-interview. This next slide shows an example of one of our standard race and ethnicity tabulations, common seen in our decennial census or the American Community Survey, which many of you are familiar with. Currently, Middle Eastern and North African responses are tabulated as part of the white alone category. And remember how we explained a few minutes ago that the OMB standards guide how responses are classified and tabulated. This is how all of that comes together when we produce standard tabulations. The categories defined by OMB are how we produce the tabulations, and this will be the Census Bureau's practice until further guidance is given by OMB. The results from the 2015 NCT research will help inform recommendations to OMB about what we learn from the reporting of Middle Eastern and North African responses and the ways in which respondents self-identify. Perhaps we will learn that Middle Eastern and North African respondents self-identify as white, regardless of whether or not there's a Middle Eastern or North African category present, or perhaps the research will show the opposite. We do not know, and please be clear that we cannot speculate, which we've been saying along, all morning, on the data and what we're going to be finding for the NCT. But we do know that this research will be critical for informing us how respondents of Middle Eastern and North African origin in the United States self-identify. And we will gain a better understanding of the context for those responses with our question designs on the re-interview. Next, I will talk with you about another perspective regarding our detailed tabulation, which I know many of us are interested in learning a little bit more about your groups. Because we plan to collect detailed responses for all race and origin groups in the 2020 census, origin that reflects identities of people from around the world, we're also planning to tabulate a richer, more diverse portrait of our country that has ever been produced. In 2020, we'll be able to produce new detailed disaggregated data table for all major groups, Black, Asians, Hispanic, etc., including new detailed disaggregated data for the Middle Eastern and North African groups. So for example, this slide shows a potential tabulation of detailed disaggregated Middle Eastern groups, and North African groups. This is similar of how we currently tabulate detailed data for the Hispanic groups or for the Asian groups. The proposed table would have a total population column at the top, followed by a line of those who are not Middle Eastern or North African, then a data line for a total Middle Eastern or North African population is provided, followed then by a list of detailed groups which are classified under this category, such as Iranian or Syrian. What I have just described are just examples of types of tabulations that could be possible from the 2020 census when we collect data for detailed Middle Eastern or North African groups. Now, once again, we want to hear from you, and we have a few questions to help you guide the discussion. And these are, how much and what kind of detailed data do you want to see in the new data products? What type of data do you currently look but cannot find? And what types of cross-tabulations do you want to see with the Middle Eastern and North African data? And what do you like about the current ACS ancestry data products? So once again, we'll just place your placards and we'll start our discussion. This side? I don't remember.
So this also connects to just before the break. I think it would be helpful, for instance, to have in terms of the like how that statistic was conducted in terms of, you know, if we're talking about Morocco, you know, what makes people identify as Arab? When, for instance, genetically, they're not, you know, the majority are Amazigh, but it's the language. So that's very problematic. So in terms of how much detail, so it would be helpful to have in terms of also language. And just because I think I'm looking at the list, I'm not even seeing I'm not even seeing like kind of the group that we're representing. It's not even on the list there.
Right now, that's a great point. The groups that are on the current proposed tabulation, and again, I remind you, it's proposed or potential. It's based on our current working definition, and that's why we're missing some of the groups that we've been discussing today here. So that's exactly what we need. We need your feedback saying, you know what, we think you should add this or this other group into your tabulation. So once again, fill the feedback sheet, and we would really appreciate that.
Okay, indeed, just in terms of the last category, so there's Arab, there's Middle Eastern, and there's North African. So just going back again, reiterate, I think the reason I bring this up again and again is that because I feel like there's not really true inclusion in that, you know, having Arab there's also, you know, when in this room there are, you know, Kurdish, Copts, you know, how many Israelis, how many Turkish in Amazigh, and then there's an Arab as a category. So I think it's very problematic that we go, like, I know that we're trying not to discuss politics, but it's very important to have, you know, to have that clear definition, or else it's just.
And I understand. So the groups that we have, as I mentioned, are from the working definition, and then the ones we have under the other Middle Eastern or North African categories, it's what we were discussing earlier today. These are the generic or general terms that people are reporting, and that's why they're included in this table. And similarly, is following the pattern that we use for the Hispanic. So for Hispanic, we have Puerto Rican, Mexican, Cuban. We have all the groups, and then we have other Hispanic, which are the people who say Hispanic or just some general terms regarding that. So again, these are just potential tabulations, but it's not necessarily how we have it. But then we do have respondents that say, I'm just Arab, I'm Middle Eastern, I'm North African. So we still capture that information. And that's why a lot of these times these groups have such large numbers, but because we're getting people that are identifying in that form. Next. In the right-in. Just as for a Hispanic, when you look at the race data, the largest race that they identify with is Mexican, Hispanic, or Latinos are among the top three.
All right. I saw that we have Algerian and Berber listed in this, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody knows that Algerian is a nationality and Berber is a race. So it's different. I wanted to know, how are you choosing those terms and how are you making this list? Whoever put this, did they know what Algerian means and what Berber means and what other thing means? Because we are mixing up things here.
So that's as we described. Do you remember my session? So when we talked about, remember how we identified all the nation states, you know, those nationalities? So looking at the research of the 15 organizations that we identified, and then we also said, but we're also including, you know, transnational groups, ethnic religious groups, right? Yeah. And so then that is our proposed working classification. So that's the feedback we want. So we've already heard a lot from many individuals here. Yeah. Hey, thumbs up, thumbs down. And so the idea with this table that you're seeing right here, so keep in mind, this is a potential tabulation. We just want your reaction, and it seems like we're getting some good reaction here. So, you know, so you're right, it is a mix of, you know, nationalities, ethnicities, or exactly. And so we just want to hear from you. Hey, now back to the very bottom of the table here, what we have, and believe it or not, we do have a very large proportion of Middle Eastern, North African population, at least based on the focus groups that identify with these higher pan-ethnicity terms. They just say, I'm Arab, or I'm just Middle Eastern. So that's what we've seen preliminary. It'll be interesting to see, right? Can't speculate what happens in the national content test when we actually have this question. Do we still see the same patterns or not? We'll be more happy to report that to you when the results come back.
One issue again with identity and identification, and maybe that's self-reporting is important in this context, because when people self-report in the American context, they do it in a very different form than they would if it was going to happen in the Middle East. If they came to me and said, who are you in Turkey? The way I would respond there and the way I would respond in the United States are very different from one another. So that's one thing we have to take into account, that these are two different contexts. Having said that, however, the way you define things in the United States has very significant political implications. I therefore would recommend that you have a joint session with the State Department. Why do I say that? If, for example, you said Western Armenians mostly come from Asia Minor. If you said there are Western Armenians and they come from Turkey, and if that is how the US Census Bureau defines and categorizes the Armenians, that would be indirectly recognizing the Armenian genocide, because Turks say that there are no Armenians, and of course the State Department hasn't yet acknowledged the genocide as such.
Okay,
so that would be a major political issue.
Thank you for your comments. You know, remember, again, you know, I just want to reemphasize here, we're talking about collection, enumerating ethnicity and race in the country, okay? As I mentioned earlier, I know there's a lot of sensitivities about what happened back in the Middle East and et cetera, and not to ignore these issues, right? But it's just, again, you're here to help us come up with a way to better enumerate this population in a census environment, okay? So thank you again for your comments.
But I would recommend maybe including an Armenian expert next time.
Okay, that's a great feedback, and you know, you're definitely right. I mean, I think and then we're gonna definitely will work with that community in contact with them, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, we did, yeah. But we did have, actually, thank you for reminding me, we did invite a number of other experts that couldn't make it at all or couldn't participate for, you know, for a variety of reasons. But again, as I want to reemphasize, this is a continuous process between now and 2020, and we'll definitely be in touch with many of those folks. Thank you. Okay,
so we're going to move over to, is there any other questions in that table? No. Okay, so we'll go to you, Rhonda.
Thank you. To answer your questions that you've posed here, because this isn't a forum for all types of comments, in terms of what types of cross-tabulations are important, with a possible creation of a MENA category or MENA category, I would be very interested in the cross-tabulations of other races that were put down, so white, black, some other race. And that would really interest me. And the other thing that would really interest me is the combination of MENA. So, for example, how many people put down Palestinian, Jordanian? And does that become one identity? That's another question for down the line, because there's a lot of Palestinians who are also Jordanian. And then I also had a comment about the current ACS ancestry data products. One of my concerns is the margin of error is sometimes quite substantial, 9,000, 10,000 people for, not such a substantial population. So that would be what I guess I don't like about the ACS data products and what I'm hoping to get from 100% count in a decennial census.
Thank you so much for your comments. And please make sure to write those down because we do want to know. And again, these are just potential tables, and that's the kind of feedback that we want. Currently, for example, for the Hispanic data, we do have, those are some kind of cross tabulations that we can do. So again, kind of simulating what we have right now, it's definitely something we could look into.
And to answer your question about what happens if someone identifies with multiple, let's say, MENA identities, well, we plan to capture that. So if they say I'm Syrian or Jordanian or Palestinian and Jordanian, that is the idea. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, Nicholas, we're planning to collect more than 2. Right now, we currently collect 2, we code 2 write-ins, for example, in the write-in line. One of the proposals that we're entertaining is to collect more than 2, maybe 3 or 4. So that's something that we're planning to do as we move forward. Okay?
That was actually my question, is how many you expect to code? And then the other point, Roberta, if I can take you back to the point where you were talking about the web form, what percentage for this testing do you sort of expect to be the web online, which has a drop-down that's different, right? It kind of allows you to do it differently than the way we're sort of conceptualizing it as a paper form.
Well, I don't know the answer as far as what percentage of the population, for this particular, for the content test, what percentage of the population will use the internet. I could tell you that right now in the ACS, about half the housing units coming in do use the web mode, if you will, but I do not know what would happen.
Roberto, part of the other research that's being done for the NCT is contact strategies, so that you enable individuals to go online. The goal is to have them go online first. But we're trying to see different contact strategies. Right. How do they help people to go online immediately or before they get a form that's mailed out to them? That's also part of this research to see what are the best ways to encourage people to go online and fill out the census. Paper will still be part of the census, but again, the goal is really to move into more of a web-based presence.
And we are looking at potentially, you said, coding more than 2.
And yes, looking into that.
Louise.
That slide, the potential tabulation, that category Arab, like I've done a lot of work on that. I could just explain a little bit how that happens. Like I looked at the block by block PUMS data. I've used this data a lot and I love it, and thank you. And so I found out by knowing where people live that Palestinians tend to say Arab. Like, and so it's a write-in response that you're not creating that. People are writing
right,
that.
Arab, right.
And when you go to the
Correct.
detailed data, you can actually kind of figure out who's writing that if you know the neighborhood patterns. Anyhow, 2 things I think would be great cross tabs. Of course, MENA and the ethnic groups by country of birth, and then a lot of second generation detail. So country of birth, U.S.
Okay.
We need...
So that would be great, and in the sense, so that's great we can get from the American Community Survey. As you know, we have those additional questions. And so what we're planning to do in the census will translate into the ACS. So if the MENA category is proposed, for example, then we'll have it there, and you can definitely have those cross tabulations. In fact, we have another content test actually in 2016, the American Community Survey content test, which is more of an operational test. It's smaller than this test that we're having in this fall, but we're looking at our coding, for example. We're looking at different data modes collection, paper, internet, face-to-face, et cetera. So we're going to see how these questions perform there too. And it gives us an opportunity to look at different characteristics as well, as you just mentioned.
And one set of data I've always wanted and have had difficulty getting, because I wanted to monitor discrimination, occupational discrimination, is occupation by industry and occupation by class of worker. Because, for example, my research shows me that people who answer managers are actually small business owners. And they're showing up as highly skilled professionals when in fact, and I think partly because of discrimination, they're ending up in the small business sector. But without that cross tab, you can't make So that would be I wrote on my form here.
So basically, all the social economic characteristics then we would still get from the American Community Survey. So once we know what we're moving forward with the 2020, then that will be the question that we will move forward for the ACS. So you will be able to capture all that information through the American Community Survey. Thank you. Rita?
I seem to have a comment for every question. In answering your question, how much and what kind of details should new data product provide? Here, again, as an insider who's now out, I can tell you the size of your binder exists for coding of Hispanic origins, so there's no reason why a similar sized binder could not exist for Middle Eastern and North African origins. And the details can go so much. So many of you mentioned the word Armenians, you know, the ethnicity that is outside Armenia. That you can, and if the Census Bureau, you work with the Census Bureau, you can have Lebanese Armenian, right? So it would be a category under Lebanese that can be given a code or any other code, or, you know, from a specific city. If I remember, Mexico City has its own code.
Well, we have a Mexican state that includes a lot of the geographies that people would report during the Hispanic, so yes. But basically, going back to the feedback, again, we included the code list in your binder, so we really, really would appreciate all the feedback that you can give us in terms of, just like Rita was saying, even something along those lines. We just want to get your feedback and say, okay, we should add a code for this.
Right.
And let's even see the data. Are people reporting this? Are they writing it in the Middle Eastern or North African line, or any other line for that matter?
And so also, thank you, Rita, for bringing that up. And when I mentioned that, it's true, you're right. The Hispanic origin list is very extensive, just like the American Indian and Alaska Native list. You know, we literally have hundreds of thousands of thousands of codes, right? Well, we never had a MENA, a Middle Eastern North African category before, so we hope to build that code list, right? So as the American people respond and they give us write-ins, and then that will help expand our code list, just as like we've done for Hispanic origin. We've had over 30 years of collecting data for that population, and so that's how we got our ideas. We're like, oh, wow, they're really identifying with these terms. We should be sensitive to that. We plan to do the same thing with the Middle Eastern and North African community as well. Okay.
Sally?
I have a couple of questions that might seem strange. So one is a suggestion, or it's a question and a suggestion. So I notice in the online form, the write-in spaces are like little cubes, so you're supposed to put them by a letter and a space. And I just wonder, whereas the online write-in spaces are just clean open spaces, and I'm just wondering if you get more responses in the online version than you do in the written form. It seems to me that the written form is like really sort of prescribing the amount of information you can put in the blank. So if you have sort of, if you're Palestinian and Armenian, that might not fit. It might discourage you from doing both.
So the online actually has the ability to collect even more information than paper does. You can continue typing
As much
and
as
I
you
think
want,
the
yeah.
number is like up to 200 characters. So also with the instructions, we're trying to encourage people to report as many identities as they identify with. And the point of this slide is to show that you could check boxes, you can write in multiple terms. We just listed 2, but again, depending on the identity that you have, it might be a very, very long term. It might be several terms, but we just wanted to raise the point that you can do any and all of the above.
On the online.
And we're looking to capture that information.
But do you also, do you find that people put less on the written form?
Well, this is the first comparison we're going to have online versus, so that's part of what we're trying to analyze.
Correct.
Do we get, again, versus the re-interview, more reliable, more accurate data, given the different modes?
And overall, what we've seen in the past is that most people give 1 or 2 write-ins at the most, regardless of the space.
Well, so my next question illustrates that I'm not a quantitative scholar. So very often I look at the tables and I get confused by the tabulation, the long tabulation list you had. So if I'm looking at Chaldeans, for example, and I want to know how, you know, if I'm trying to count up all the Arab Americans in the Detroit area, I have a hard time when I get to the Chaldeans being listed. So if you got all the national origins, right, and then you have a few of the identities listed there as well, then how many of those Chaldeans are, you know, if I add Chaldean and Iraqi, am I double counting people or not? So just finding a way for someone like me who's not is not as proficient at using the data as Louise is, to be able to come up with really well-rounded counts, and then I'm also curious, how many Iraqis are checking Chaldean and how many Chaldeans are also checking Iraqi. So just to make sure that I know that data is already available, but you can see my.
So that conceptually is not new for us. That's already happening with other groups where we tabulate data, and we have at least two decades now of history of looking at multiple responses. And so that's multiple across major groups like white and Asian and black, but also multiple within groups like Puerto Rican and Cuban or Jamaican and Nigerian. We look to see how we can accomplish that same premise as we're looking at the data for Middle Eastern North African groups.
Linda?
I think you already made this point, but I really want to reiterate it because it could really get messy. It's already messy. We got to take the politics out of the conversation, and that doesn't mean that we as communities need to not talk about this and have these difficult dialogues. I mean, we go through this all the time within our own communities every day. We talk about anti-black racism within Arab communities. I mean, these are discussions that happen all the time. We talk about what's happening on the other side of the world. It's just not helpful for what we're trying to do right here. And I also want to make sure as we're making recommendations that you guys are verifying some of the recommendations that are coming to you, because I'm from New York City and I work with a very large North African community, and Berbers are not a race, for example. They are very racially diverse. There are black Berbers, there are light-skinned Berbers, right? So Berber is more of an ethnicity or a shared common language, for example, that's different than Arabic, right? So we need to make sure that as we're giving recommendations, that we're also not giving incorrect information that then is implemented in a way that doesn't actually align with the actual communities that are out in the communities that we're going to try to have this happen. And the other thing I want to say, and it's not because I'm Arab, but I want to also make the point that when we're talking about MENA, there are 23 Arab countries, right? There's a big, vast group of people that we're talking about, not to say that they are the most important group, but making sure that we're also engaging the minorities within those 23 Arab countries, which are part of what we're talking about. So I'm trying to figure out how we get to a common place or a place of common ground where we're looking at MENA not as what people identify, but if I'm, Assyrian or as an Assyrian, not Syrian, anyway, or Chaldean, for example, that people see that that's reflected and not to be blinded by this, this thing called MENA that they don't like connect to, but then there's another category that you do connect to. So I'm just worried about this all or nothing kind of situation that we get into. We have something that I think is very robust. There's been a lot of work, and I just want to give homage where it's due. I mean, people like Helen have been doing this for 30 years. I mean, we can't just break down a building that someone has built over the past 30 years. So I think just having a more thoughtful conversation, thinking about the work that has gone from the government side, but also from the community side, and trying to come to a place of common ground. I'm not hearing that much common ground happening, and I'm worried that this conversation went a different direction. I'm sure you knew it was going to be messy, and you probably had this with other communities. But can we not do what's happening, the mess that's happening on the other side of the world? Can we be the example where we actually figure out a way to work together, make sure people are represented, minorities feel that we're upholding them, but we're moving forward. So I'm worried that we're not going in that direction based on the observations here.
I want to say thank you for your comment, and I think you stated a great point. I think if we were all to discuss here what race, ethnicity, or ethno-religious or any term, if we were to discuss right now all these terms and say, what is race for you, what is an ethnicity for you, we would never agree. And even in our meetings when we're trying to say, okay, this is an ethnic group, a race group, or what are we calling this? We don't even agree with ourselves sometimes or with other areas. And I want to go back to what we were discussing in terms of the panels and remind you, we're also testing that. We're asking, what is your race or origin? What is your race or ethnicity? Which categories describe you without even asking a term within the question stem? Because we know that each person sees this term in different ways, So I appreciate that comment because it is true, it's very important. In terms of the Arab, it's a great point, and I think it goes along the lines of the previous session that we were discussing. What other classifications would you possibly add? So then are you saying maybe we should also have an Arab classification, for example, or possibly an Arab tabulation? So these are things that we need your feedback on, and if you think that it is something that we should include, then fill those forms and give us that feedback, because this is what we need from you in order for us to know what are we going to move forward with. I'm going to go to this table. Khalid.
Yeah, just to kind of be forward thinking. I mean, ideally speaking, we adopt this classification. Doesn't necessarily mean that this classification qualifies as a disadvantaged minority group, right? So disadvantage, I think, is something that needs to be contemplated and highlighted, specifically because there is this broad myth that MENA folk, if I can use the acronym, MENA folk are at least economically upwardly mobile, and quote unquote model minorities and so forth, which is in some respects just an adoption of the Lebanese or Syrian American experience. So I'm really concerned with the question that you have highlighted is cross-tabulations that kind of feature or closely highlight the specific socioeconomic circumstances of specific nationality groups which suffer disadvantage and suffer animus and marginalization at higher rates. So for instance, Yemeni Americans who are highly underrepresented in colleges and universities have an experience that veers away from Lebanese or Syrian Americans. So disadvantage, I think, is something I'm really interested in with regard to my research and with regard to anti-racism and civil rights advocacy work.
Thank you. Sahar?
Yes.
Okay.
I just wanted to give a little clarification about the quote-unquote Arab identity. The implicit assumption in our conversation is that the people answering these questions are first or second generation immigrants who still have very strong conscious identifications with either a national origin or an ethnic origin. And we need to think about third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation from now. For example, so I identify as an Egyptian American, but I was born in Cairo. But I have met second or third generation people from the Middle East and North Africa who identify as Arab American. They don't speak Arabic. Their parents, their grandparents had immigrated here, and the way they socialize is with other Arab, with other Arab Americans. And so the national identity, or the national origin identity, or the ethnic origin identity starts to become diluted in terms of how they self-identify. Some of them completely pass into being white in terms of their social experience, depending on their morphology and phenotype and skin color and hair texture, and some don't. And so we need to be also thinking about the future, because although some of us in the room know exactly how we identify, and it's very specific and particularized, that might not be the case in 3 or 4 generations. And so we do need to have these kind of broader groups where people may say, no, I'm not really connected to being a Lebanese per se, or being an Egyptian per se, or my parents are mixed, or my grandparents are mixed. So I just wanted to kind of put a plug in for these broader categories to keep them there, or people are going to probably write them in, is particularly in the future. In terms of identifying the ethnic groups that are not just national, but are transnational, you have already done this, I'm sure, and you can talk to the experts. But one way that might determine whether these categories will have some longevity into future generations is whether you're seeing communities completely defined around it. So if you're seeing churches that are defined around a certain ethnic identity, more likely that's going to stick. That's going to stay for multiple generations, because people are going to be going to this church or to this, whatever it is that mobilizes them, that will preserve that identity over generations, as opposed to becoming kind of, I hate to use melting pot, but that will melt away over time, for better or worse. But that's one thing, again, you get the experts for that, but that might be a way to start looking at those groups. And I just want to echo Khalid's comments that for the purposes of the anti-discrimination benefits of tracking, is the more that you can have data on indicia of subordination, that's not unique to Middle East North Africans, whether it's education, socioeconomics, income. I think that would be very helpful, because we can extrapolate from that, or we can deduce from that the risk and the vulnerabilities in terms of potential discrimination or existing discrimination.
Thank you so much for that. And I do want to note, though, that exactly what you're saying about how generations would change is something that we also see with the Hispanic community. I think it's a great example. When we do a lot of the re-interviews or a lot of the cognitive testing, what we find is that we say, well, you know, I'm Salvadoran, but my child was born here, so he's American. So we already lose that. So a lot of what we've been doing in our cognitive testing is trying to get families where the parents are foreign-born, to kind of see how they identify themselves and how they identify their children. So it's something that we've been looking at in our cognitive testing, and not only for Hispanics, but for all the groups that we try to interview. So thank you so much for your comment. Okay, I have 2 more minutes, so I'm gonna go to Dr. Cohen.
I'll try to answer the questions. How much and what kind of details should new data product provide? I understand that you can't, I mean, in order to provide socioeconomic data, you have to use the ACS. So that's only 1%. So one thing that I'm not clear about is the 100% available for researchers, or only the census can produce tables?
Are you referring to this actual census data? We have census data centers where you can go and, you know, you submit a proposal. And
I see, and then you go to the data center.
Go to the data center and look at that.
But still, I mean, the questions are limited. It's age, it's
right.
age,
There's
sex.
no, right, in the census form, right.
So
it is.
And why would these data be different than the data I can get from the ACS with the ancestry question? Let's assume I'm interested in Yemenite. So I go to the ACS, I look at all Yemenites, education, etc.
What we've heard from many of the experts here is that the ethnicity groups, racial groups from the MENA region is undercounted, right? Underestimated. This is what I've been hearing.
So with the new MENA category, we believe we'll have.
We can't speculate what will happen. So many of us here probably
so
think.
Actually,
it'll be interesting to see what the population size is on this test. I don't know. I cannot.
Aside from the fact that we'll have a better base, right now we're working off the ancestry question. So for example, for Hispanics, we work off the estimates during intercensal years, but then decennial will adjust that. So we will possibly have a better base or a better count in order to use for the American Community Survey as well.
I see, okay. What kind of data you currently look? Okay, I'm interested, and many of us are interested in second generation, but you know, we dropped the parental country of birth, so we can't do that. I don't know about, I mean, obviously socioeconomic issues are important. What do you like about the current ACS ancestry data product? I don't know if you're aware of it, but what I really like about it is that it's accessible. And the US is the only country in the world that I know that anybody can go to any computer, go to the pumps, that, you know, and take the ACAs and analyze them. I've been working with data in Germany, in Canada, in Israel. I need to be there physically. I need to have a co-author who is a citizen of the country. And then people ask, well, why all the research is done in America? What is this ethnocentrism? No, because the data are available. So keep the data available. Now, why am I saying all this? Because I'm afraid that Congress is going to cut the budgets for the ACS. So in my comments, I'm going to write this point, and hopefully it will go all the way up to Congress. Because, look, the next ACS and the next census under new administration, and the ACS is always in danger, and we should all be aware of it.
Thank you for your comments.
Thank you so much for your comment. So I believe we have Fareed.
Yeah, so echoing Dr. Cohen's comments, I actually used ACS data. Well, we did a study in 2013 trying to understand Sudanese Americans who are recent immigrants, relatively recent immigrants to the US, with the help of Dr. Sami Al-Badri and Helen. And so we've already used the data, and of course we found out that there's very little data about Sudanese Americans. So we want more data about Sudanese Americans, and we want to understand how they're faring. We have evidence that they're not doing very well as recent immigrants in America, and so we want to study why, what are the barriers to their success in America. And so we need a lot more data. We want more detail about our community. So, but keep doing what you're doing, and more details and accessibility is what we need.
Thank you so much for that. And I appreciate all of your comments. So now we're going to move on. I'm going to let Roberto introduce the director.
Okay, so it looks like we caught up on time, so far so good. Okay, so before we begin our final session of the day, I'm honored to introduce to you Mr. John Thompson, the Director of the U.S. Census Bureau. Prior to his appointment as Director of the Census Bureau in 2013, Director Thompson served as President and Executive Officer of the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. As Census Director, Mr. Thompson will oversee preparations for the 2020 census and preside over more than 100 other surveys that measure America's people, places, and economy. Before joining the National Opinion Research Center, Director Thompson had a distinguished career working at the Census Bureau from 1975 to 2002. So yes, he did come back to join us and help us with the 2020 census. As Associate Director, he was the senior career executive responsible for all aspects of the 2000 census. Please join me in welcoming Director John Thompson.
Thanks, Roberto. I'm delighted to be here. And I think in my remarks, you'll probably hear a repeat of many of the things you've heard today, but I think that's a good thing because it will affirm that I'm as committed to this issue as my colleagues that are working hard on it. So I appreciate you coming out to Suitland to provide us with your insights and perspectives. And even though I wasn't here for much of the meeting, I could see for the period of time I was here that we were getting some great feedback. As you've heard, one impetus for all of this was the 2010 alternative questionnaire experiment, when many focus group participants had a hard time responding to the race question within the existing race categories. The Census Bureau's mission is to produce accurate and relevant statistics about the nation's people, including those of Middle Eastern North African heritage. So this was a serious concern to us. As we worked to address this issue, we received a lot of help, good help, I might add. Our relationship with the Middle Eastern and North African community has been characterized by cooperation and mutual interest, going back to educational partnerships during the census in 2000 and 2010. Your participation today is very much appreciated and very valued. We recognize that as your information we collect to produce our statistics, and we depend on your cooperation and trust to improve these statistics. Last year, we received a lot of support for adding a Middle Eastern and North African category to the census, both from our National Advisory Committee as well as the OMB Interagency Working Group on Race and Ethnicity. In response, and as you've heard today, we've been exploring how to collect data for respondents of Middle Eastern and North African heritage in our mid-decade testing. As part of that process, we consulted with OMB, other federal agencies, demographic and sociological associations, academics, race and ethnicity experts, and others. We're now turning our attention to the 2015 National Content Test, which will take place this September. As part of the National Content Test, we'll test the Middle Eastern North African category, as you've been hearing about today, in both the combined Hispanic origin and race questions and in the two separate questions approach. In preparation for that, we've developed a testing plan and a working classification Middle Eastern or North African based on our research and outreach. And we've gotten a lot of comments on that already. In 2016, we'll analyze the results of the test. We will look at how each approach, the combined question and two separate questions fared. We will also assess the usage of the Middle Eastern North African category, how people responded to it, and our classification of the groups that fall into that category. Then we will discuss our findings with stakeholders and advisors. At the end of the day, we'll use this process of research and feedback to make recommendations to OMB on whether or not a Middle Eastern or North African category should be included in the 2020 census. Our deadline to submit the 2020 topics to Congress is in early 2017, and the final question wording is due to the Congress in April of 2018. Throughout this whole process, we have consulted with a host of stakeholders, academics, interest groups, community members, and everyone here today. Your input today on the terms that we are using and on our working definitions and tabulation issues is a critical part of our planning process, and I thank you. As we move forward, we'll continue to receive feedback from you and others on our research, particularly on the results of the 2015 content test. And I'm confident that working together, we can make progress in a way that meets the community's needs and helps the Census Bureau capture the best possible information. Again, many thanks for your participation today. I appreciate your ongoing interest and support of the Bureau's work, and your perspective on this issue is very valuable to us. So thank you again. And I'd love to answer some questions, have a dialogue if there's any interest in that.
If you have any questions for the director, just please put your name up.
Director, this is my first time in the Census Bureau.
Please speak in the microphone.
This is my first time in the Census Bureau, probably my first time in such a major federal institution. I know you guys are probably, some of you treat this as a job, some of them treat this as a career. This is clearly for me, for my community, probably for many of the communities here, a real calling. This is a real work that will, I see 30 years from now, Linda and I calling us a MENA Palestinian and a MENA Israeli. This can really change how people define themselves as human beings, and I'm very, very impressed.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oren. It means a lot. Any other questions for the director? Please raise your hand. Yes. Go ahead, please.
I don't have a question. I just want to say something I think has to be said before we leave here. It's so great that this is happening now. We've wanted it for a long time. But I want you all to keep in mind there's also extensive fear in this community, and I don't want any potential negative impact of that, like non-response, to change the forward momentum we're gathering now. You know, surveillance, et cetera, it's very strong in these community government surveillance. So maybe, you know, your next test won't turn out as robust as we wanted, but that shouldn't shut the door. That's what I want to say.
Thank you.
So that's part of the outreach that we like to hear from you, get the word out, right, of what we're doing, that we're attempting to enumerate the population, right? Yes, let's see, where are we at? Rhonda?
I just wanted to say that I am personally very thankful that we are becoming more visible to the Census Bureau as a community, or communities as the case is, and perhaps to the government in general as a group. And I think it's very important that we're acknowledged, because often, you know, when you check, or when I checked, and I'm sure other people in the room, some other race, and I put in Arab, American, and then I was reclassified as white. You know, I think that it has a negative impact on pride, pride in my origins and pride in general. And I think that as researchers, and sometimes researchers who are studying the group that we write about, it's a dual calling, both scholarly and activist. And I think it's a very important thing that we're being heard, and I wanted to thank the Census Bureau for that.
Okay, we're just going to take just 3 more questions, okay? So I think, Ratna, you have one real quick?
Yeah, thank you very much. Again, this is wonderful. I'm sure you have heard that enough. But to me, what was most interesting is to see this whole process, not from our point of view with respect to our identity, meaning, and knowledge, but rather how the Census Bureau sees the whole process. From that point of view, I'm very interested to see what you think is going to be the most significant challenge you'll be facing in carrying on with this process.
So, putting this in the context of a lot of the challenges we face at the Census Bureau, I think this one doesn't have those same kind of challenges. I'm confident we're going to do a test. We're going to get the results. We'll look at the results and study those. There are a lot of other issues which we don't have as much time, enough time to probably talk about that caused me to lose a lot of sleep at night, but this isn't one of them.
All right, we're going to take one last question. Samer, in the interest of time.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here. I'm somewhat new to the game. I just took over a nonprofit civil rights organization, and I've been here for about a year and a half, and I've been really delving into the census issue, because it's been a very big issue among our community. The one thing that kind of took me aback was this sort of sense of people outside of our community who are thrusting upon us their definition of what we are and how we should identify ourselves. To me, I'll be honest, it's off-putting to me that somehow somebody in Washington, D.C. has decided that I am white, or that a Sudanese is not a Middle Easterner, or a Somali does not belong within the Middle Eastern category. To me, I think it's borderline offensive. I think you really, and I think this gathering goes a long way to diffusing that, because here you're seeing, you're hearing how we identify ourselves. I think that's extremely important. I wish you would really follow through on that and talk to some of these other communities, because you're asking us who should be in, who should be out. Well, you should also be asking those specific communities whether they want to be in or whether they want to be out. And I think that should sort of not be the 100% deciding factor, but I think that needs to be one of the biggest components. Thank you.
I agree. Okay, well, thank you very much, and we're going to continue the dialogue, and hopefully in about a year from now, we'll have some pretty interesting test data to discuss with you. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Director Thompson. Okay, so I am getting a signal that before everyone leaves, we're going to take a picture. So make sure no one leaves, okay? So we'll do this after this last session. I believe we only have a few slides left, session E. Okay, so before we adjourn, I want to ensure that everyone understands that the results from this expert forum and the 2015 National Content Test will lead to recommendations for the 2020 census, as I've been mentioning all day. So this graphic provides a high-level timeline for making decisions on content, okay? So last October, we announced our plans for content research that will be conducted in the National Content Test. And in December, the Federal Register notice was posted. And so to elicit public comment on this mid-decade research, and as Nicholas mentioned earlier, we received thousands of comments. And so, this is still under review as I just spoke, and it's right now with OMB, and we'll be sending an email out for additional comments for the next 30 days, and we want to hear from you, and your comments will be reviewed. So we could continue in preparations to conduct the 15 tests later this year. Work is also underway to prepare for our 2016 national content test in the American Community Survey, as I mentioned, next spring. So it's a smaller survey. Well, should I say it's a smaller sample? But we're looking at a lot of our operations coding, for example, and for different data mode collections. So it's a very important test also for a question. In 2016, we will analyze the results of the 2015 National Content Test and discuss the findings with stakeholders and external advisors. This will feed into our work as we prepare for the recommendations to ONB. Recall that right now we're working very closely with ONB and its interagency committee. And so through this agency, interagency committee, we plan to make recommendations. By early 2017, the 2020 census topics must be submitted to Congress, with the final question wording due to Congress in April of 2018, so that we can finalize the content for the 2020 census, as you can imagine, which is just around the corner, believe it or not, even though it's about 5 years away. In 2018, we will conduct an end-to-end operational readiness test for all systems, and in 2019, we must finalize and test the operational and processing plans to actually collect, edit, and tabulate the 2020 census data. All along the way, as you can see, as we're doing now at the bottom of the timeline, we'll continue outreach, dialogue with stakeholders, communities, and such, and continue to do this all the way up to the 2020 census, and even actually afterwards, because then, of course, we got to go on our, on our tour to go and announce the results from the 2020 census, which took us about a year after the 2010 census to do. So this these interactions are very important to us, and we'll continue to provide feedback and engage in these conversations. So what is next? So first, I want to thank all of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to travel to the Census Bureau and discuss an important topic with us. I didn't mention this earlier because I know many of you are very busy and you got to run. But for those of you who are interested in a very quick tour, it would be my honor to give you a quick tour of the Census Bureau. If you like to wait here at 4:30, I'll be more than happy to walk you through here and kind of see some of the sites if you're interested. Okay, if you're ready to go, I understand. Second, please remember to return your feedback worksheets for each session to us today if you can. I really would like to have those. Now, if you need a little more time to fill those out, please do, and make sure that you send it back to us. I believe you have electronically, and you just send that back to us to the emails that staff have been contacting you with, okay? Because it's really, please, it's very, very critical that you give us your feedback, okay? So, go. Angie and Rachel will they be getting, okay? So we'll be compiling all these results. Obviously, we're planning to produce a proceedings report sometime in the fall, and we plan to send that to all of you here, okay? So, let's see. So as I mentioned before, the results of this forum and the National Content Test will help us make recommendations for 2020. And we hope that the final report coming from the National Content Test results will be sometime in the fall of 2016. So third, let's see. So we haven't really discussed it today, but in your binder, you also have the code list. I think it's really critical that you also provide us, comments on the code list that we have right now. It'll be really critical to expanding the code list as we mentioned before. And then finally, what I would like to do is, actually just take the last few minutes. We have 10 minutes before 4 o'clock. If there are any other additional questions or comments that you would like to make before we adjourn officially at 4 o'clock. Great. That means, we do have one over here. Gigi?
Sorry.
No, of course not.
it'll be quick. First, again, to reiterate what others have said, thank you so much for having this. I can't tell you how much this just helps our spirits and the feelings about our group. And we've been waiting so long for this that this is really a fantastic experience, and thank you so much. Also, I was wondering if you had any plans for future meetings such as this after the data comes in. Is this going to be an ongoing?
Well, I do know we've been invited to a couple of conferences, and we'll be at a conference in November with MESA, and a couple of other organizations have asked us, hey, what are the results? And so we'll continue to do that with internal and external stakeholders, and so we'll continue to do that. So if you have a conference in Austin, I'm from San Antonio, so you can certainly invite me to come talk to you about what's happening, but we'll continue this process of this dialogue and communication. So, yes.
One thing I want to mention is that I'm here to represent the Turks, but I talked about the complexity of that in general, I hope, especially with respect to Armenians and Kurds and all the others who are not included. There's another complexity that comes from my own life experience here. I actually have children who are half Turkish and half German Jewish, which is fascinating in many ways, but putting that aside, what's very important there is that the State of Israel is established in 1948. It's quite recent. What do you do with the category of people who have been here, who are Jewish before then? Because when you say religious is not a part of it, you do not include, obviously, them in any way. They are not fully American either because they do not see themselves as American in the European sense. So that, I think, is going to be a very important issue. I would recommend maybe having, in addition to the Israeli, groups, to also bring in American Jewish groups, so of course predated. In my case, the ascendants came here in the 1820s. Now, how do they then?
Well, I can tell you this. This feedback that you've given us today has been tremendous. And so, we're going to go back and regroup, and you know what? I think there's going to be some more engagement, perhaps some more forums down the road. So, to engage other stakeholders that you mentioned today, that you feel that are absent here, that need to be here. And so we want to hear from those, you know, you could recommend other groups that we should talk to, and so we will continue that dialogue, absolutely. So, okay, any final last comments? Yes, speak to the mic, please.
Well, thank you very much for the forum. I would like to ask the expert here not to categorize us in their papers, whatever research, as sub-ethnic groups. We are an ethnic group, so not as a minority or sub-ethnic group. We are a group in the Middle East and a large group in the Middle East, so it's in a way very offensive. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I talk about the Kurds. So.
Okay, so then we'll end with the last two questions over there.
No, I just wanted to actually really thank you. In as much as the conversation was tense, I think it's helpful, especially to just show what the community's, the tension between that. I think it's very helpful to actually see that and to hear the different conversations. So my apologies for any, unintended offense, but I think it's really important how deeply it matters to each one of, whether it's Arab or Amazigh or Kurdish, how this is really a huge, deep issue, in that it's important to have these types of conversations, as heated as they were.
No, that's fine. In fact, that was the purpose, remember. That's what we asked the feedback. And which is why we started out by saying, look, we're not seeking 100% consensus. We want your feedback. And that's what we had today. In fact, honestly, I thought it went really, really well today. So, no worries. I could tell everyone in here is just as passionate as I am. So, yes, we'll end with one last comment or question.
Okay, I just wanted to thank you for having us today and for this very fruitful debate and forum. And I wish and hope that North Africa will be separated and kept away from Middle East. Please, 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 it's very important to our community and for the Amazigh population. Thank you so much.
Certainly will review and consider all feedback that comes in. Thank you very much. Okay.
I want to thank Helen for her 30-year dedication to this cause.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you.